Hey everybody, and welcome to the Infinite Dial 2019, my favorite day of the year. I'm Edison Senior Vice President Tom Webster, and I'm here with my friend, Triton Digital's John Rosso. John, how are you?
I'm fine, Tom. How are you?
I am outstanding. This is like my Super Bowl. This is one of my favorite days of the year.
This is actually my favorite day of the year, not just because of the Infinite Dial, but did you know that today is National Oreo Day as well?
I did not know that.
Just in case, just was wondering.
So, and that's the conclusion of our broadcast. No, we've got a lot in store for you today, John. What have we got?
So as usual on the Infinite Dial, we will be looking at the use of social media, consumption of online audio, use of media and technology, including in-car media, consumption of various audio brands, and of course, the big finish, which will be podcasting this year, Tom.
Yes, we are going to close out with podcasting. And by the way, I know that there are some viewing parties out there. I'd like to say hi to them. I know the Libsyn folks are watching, and we'll give some shout outs as we go along. And did you know that somebody made a bingo card?
Can you tweet us pictures of your viewing party
Yeah,
with the hashtag Infinite Dial?
Today's hashtag is Infinite Dial. Thanks for that. I'm not doing my job because
Bingo card?
Not terrible at it.
Well,
Someone made bingo cards.
Bingo cards.
Someone made bingo cards that feature some of the phrases that John and I like to say as if we repeat ourselves a lot.
Go figure.
We're going to try and thwart that as best we can. We'll mention things like hurling stick growth, for instance, instead of, well, I can't say it.
Or I'll say, thank you, Tom, instead of the other thing.
The other thing, right. So we're going to try and make it hard on you for you bingo players. But we do have a lot of great stuff to get through today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with that. First of all, the Infinite Dial is the longest running study of digital media behavior amongst consumers in America. It's been going continuously since 1998. This is my 15th year doing the Infinite Dial.
You don't look that old.
I was just a boy when I started, but here I am today. And we've essentially done it the same way every year with the same gold standard methodology. We use telephone sampling to do this. Telephone sampling remains really the most accurate way and the only way to truly represent the US population so that these numbers are in fact projectable to the US population. We divide the interviews up proportionally between landline and cell phone to meet the current US stats on that. We deliver it in English and Spanish, and then the data is weighted to census figures. So again, everything that you're going to see is going to be representative and projectable to the US population. We've got quite a consequential report this year, John. I think some things will make some news, and certainly one of the things that I think is going to make some news are some of the particular findings in our social media section. So we're going to start with that. We've been tracking social media for well over a decade now. And currently, if we look at the population 12 plus who say they have ever used social media, that number right now, currently ever using social media, that number now is 79%. And if you step back from this graph and sort of look at it from a distance for the last 4 years, it's really flat. We're now at an estimated 223 million people 12 plus who say they use social media, and it kind of seems like we may have hit peak social, John. We might have flattened out on that. Now, social media brands remain some of the most widely known brands in America. You can see Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter all exceed 90% awareness, which means more people are aware of these brands than actually have internet access. That's certainly especially true with Facebook. And you see all of these brands have become fairly well known, all the way even down to LinkedIn and WhatsApp, which we've included this year. Usage, however, is a very different story. Now, some of the brands on here have remained fairly stable over the last 3 years, which mirrors overall social media consumption. But you can see a fairly significant drop for Facebook from 2017 to today. 2 years ago, 67% of persons 12 plus used Facebook. Today, 61% do. We also see a drop with Twitter over the past 2 years. That's second from the bottom on this list. Twitter's gone from 23% of Americans 12 plus to 19%. So those two brands have taken some declines. We do see an increase with Instagram, which has gone from 34 to 39 in the past 2 years. And really everything else is fairly stable. LinkedIn remains very stable at 22. Just to zoom in a little bit on that Facebook stat, here's our Facebook tracking all the way back in 2008 when it was 8% of the US population. And you can see really Facebook kind of peaked in 2017 and it's fallen off 2 years in a row. So that's That's looking like a trend. That's looking like a trend to me. We're kind of back down to 2015 levels of usage. So that's still an estimated 172 million users. It's still certainly a very widely used brand. I myself use it every day. But that number, that decline, works out to a net of 15 million fewer Facebook users today than in 2017. Now that does not mean that 15 million Americans deleted their Facebook accounts or did anything so draconian. If that's on your bingo card, draconian. But it does mean that a net of 15 million fewer people are using it. And there's a very clear demographic story here. If we look at this by sort of three broad age groups, you'll see 55 plus actually grew from 49% to 53%, which certainly implies that if we have 15 million fewer users today and 55 plus actually grew, that we see some fairly steep declines. And we see that age 12 to 34. 2 years ago, 79% of 12 to 34-year-olds use Facebook. Today, 62% tell us they use Facebook. And to work that out into raw numbers, that was 82 million 12 to 34-year-olds 2 years ago. And today, 65 million 12 to 34-year-olds say that they use Facebook. That's a decline of 17 million users in the 12 to 34-year-old demographic. Where have they gone, you might ask? And
where have they gone, Tom?
I'd said you might ask.
I might ask.
And you did. And I might well answer, it's kind of confusing. They may not have gone anywhere. If you look, Facebook certainly declined 12 to 34, and Twitter also sees a decline 12 to 34. But the other social media brands really didn't see significant increases 12 to 34. So it's not like they left Facebook to go somewhere else necessarily, at least in the past couple of years. They just stopped using Facebook as much. Now here's a question that we've asked for the last 5 years. Which social media brand do you use most often? What's the most popular social media brand in America? Continues to be Facebook at 52% of persons who use social media, so it is still in the majority. But it's lost a fair amount of mind share here since 2015 when it was 65%. Now you can see certainly that both Instagram and Snapchat have grown. And one of the kind of really interesting things on this graph is something that might get overlooked, and that's the percentage of other at the end has gone from 15 down to 14 and 12, and now it's at 9. So that kind of means that people are just using fewer platforms. Fewer platforms are being named for this question. And I'll round out this section by looking at this same data by 12 to 34-year-olds, and this tells a fairly alarming story for Facebook, at least 12 to 34. In 2015, 58% of this young end demo said that Facebook was the brand they used most often, followed by 15% for Instagram. Today, those two numbers are 29 and 26, and you can see Snapchat here has really grown to be kind of in a tie for first place with Facebook. And certainly, Facebook and Instagram combined in 2019 are lower with 12 to 34-year-olds than Facebook alone was in 2015. So there's a real story roiling under the surface of these data with social media, and I will of course be on Facebook later to talk about it, because
I'll be on Snapchat.
You'll be on the Snapchat, and I'll be pinning things as well. So that's a look at social media brands. Of course, all of these social media brands are accessed through technology, and with that terrible segue, I awkwardly hand things back over to John Rosso.
All right, thank you, Tom. Now we dig into our media and technology section, first with a look at smartphone ownership. Now, some 12 years ago, after the launch of the iPhone, smartphones are nearly ubiquitous with 84% penetration. However, as you'd expect, at some point, the market just becomes saturated and the growth slows. So this is what appears to be happening now, as ownership of smartphones levels off in the mid 80% range. We estimate that 237 million Americans 12 plus now own a smartphone, and right now about 200 million of them are receiving robocalls. Now let's look at what's happening with tablet ownership. After 4 years of relative stability, we're seeing a significant move up by 6 points in 2019. That's actually a 12% increase. I wondered what was driving this increase, so took a look inside the data. And there are increases in penetration of both Apple and Android tablets, but it's the Amazon Fire tablet that grew fastest, up 23%. year over year. Now, many wondered whether there would ever be a consumer market for tablet devices. Well, with 158 million of them out there just in the US today, and global sales volumes of over 150 million units a year, the tablet business seems to be doing just fine. And now onto my favorite section of the infinite dial, the one where we talk about smart speakers. Alexa, set an alarm for 3 a.m. Now, that's not a phrase that you'd want the device on your desk to hear, so you might want to mute its microphone for a while. We've been tracking awareness of smart speakers for 3 years. In 2017, about 2 years after Amazon launched the Alexa service, awareness was already quite high at 69%. In 2018, now 4 years into Alexa and 2 years after the launch of Google Home, awareness was at 75%. And awareness increases again this year to 79%, which represents 223 million Americans 12 plus. So that's awareness of smart speakers. Now let's look at actual ownership. Ownership of smart speakers more than doubled between 2017 and 2018. And we have another big increase this year, with 23% of those 12 plus now owning one or more. That's 1 in 5 people, almost 1 in 4. As I mentioned a moment ago, Amazon launched the Alexa in 2014, a full 2 years ahead of Google Home hitting the market. Alexa still has a considerable lead over Google Home in the US. However, in Canada, Google Home launched at about the same time as Alexa, and according to our 2018 Infinite Dial Canada survey, Google has a considerably larger share of that market. And then we have Apple's HomePod at just 2%. At almost 5 times the price of an Echo Dot or a Google Home Mini, it's not surprising that the HomePod has a much more limited appeal. Whether it's Amazon's Echo, Google Home, or the Apple HomePod, it's clear that smart speakers are not just that goofy fad that my wife insisted they would be. In 2018, we reported that smart speaker-equipped households had on average 1.7 devices, with 2/3 of those households owning just one smart speaker, and only 11% owning 3 or more. In our 2019 survey, we find that the number of repeat customers for smart speakers is going up significantly, with the average number of units per household now increasing to 2. The number of people who told us they own 2 devices grew, but not nearly as much as the 3 or more category, which more than doubled to 24%. That suggests that when people go back to buy their second device, they're not just stopping at 2, and instead buying multiple additional units. Tom?
John?
You ever think about what people do with all those smart speakers?
Well, I have a rich and fascinating home life, John. I hope the machines aren't listening to me, but why don't you tell us?
Well, frequently, Tom, it's to listen to online audio in all of its various forms. Now, as a reminder, we define online audio in the Infinite Dial survey as the listening to the online streams of AM and FM radio stations or to streamed audio content available only on the internet. And now let's move into our 2019 update on the world of online audio. Once again, the listening to online audio increases, with 67% of Americans 12 plus telling us that they listen at least monthly. That 67% now represents 189 million people. We've been tracking this behavior for almost 20 years now, and with only a few exceptions, we've seen growth every year. And that growth seems to be powered mostly by old people, those aged 55 plus, like some people we know. In that demo, we saw a significant move up by 7 points, which is an increase of 21%. There was a smaller but still significant increase from 88 to 91% in the 12 to 24 demo, while 25 to 54 held steady year over year. And as you would expect, the number of people who say they listen to online audio weekly has increased as well, now estimated to be 169 million people. That's 60% of those 12 plus, compared to 57% a year ago. A few slides back, Tom told you that 61% of Americans say they've used Facebook. It's worth noting that the reach of online audio is now about the same as Facebook and far larger than any other social media. We've seen the time spent listening to online audio bouncing around quite a bit since 2014, but this year there's a solid move up to 16 hours and 43 minutes per week. That's a 22% increase compared to last year's 13 hours and 40 minutes. It's likely that much of the increase is attributable to the increasing convenience of listening on smart speakers. Now, when you see someone on the street wearing headphones, it's easy to assume that they're listening to music or maybe a podcast, maybe, Tom, your podcast, right?
I doubt it.
Well, if they're not listening to your podcast, maybe they're listening to our old friend, the audiobook. And after a long flat period, we're seeing a significant increase in the number of people who listen to audiobooks. You know, there's another data point that suggests that audiobooks are increasing in popularity, and that's the 20+% growth in revenue that the industry reported last year. So audiobooks certainly continuing to increase in popularity after a long period of flatness. And now for our look at what people are listening to on the road, here's Tom with our in-car media section.
You know, really the biggest innovation in the in-car media section this year, John, is that we've replaced the stock photo.
Yes, with a car that was made this century.
With a car made in this century. We used to use, I think it was a 1982, so it was an Eastern European car.
I believe like a Lada or something.
A Lada, something like that. Trabant, maybe, with a cassette deck. But we have invested in new stock photography with our spanky new template here. So that's the most significant finding. But there are others, and I'm going to talk about them now. First of all, we asked people, which audio sources do you ever use in your car? And by the way, the base for this graph are people who have either driven or ridden in a car in the last month, which is just about 90% of the population. AM/FM radio remains the dominant source here at 81% of riders and drivers saying they have listened to AM/FM radio in their car in the last month. And kind of tied for second, we have your own music, whether it's in a digital file or in a CD player. And then we have online radio at 28%, podcasts at 26%, and Sirius XM satellite radio at 22%. Now, one of the things that we know from another research project that we have ongoing called Share of Ear is that the share of time people spend listening to these sources at home and at work have juggled around a little bit over the past 4 or 5 years. So we have seen some movement there. But in the car, things remain relatively stable. And we'll look here at trending for the last 3 infinite dial studies. You can see AM/FM radio very stable, 82, 81% all 3 years. And owned digital music also incredibly stable at 45%. You do see a decline here with CD players going from 52% 2 years ago to 43% this year. And I think some of that, John, is just because a lot of new cars aren't even installing CD players. So that Styx Greatest Hits CD you love to rock, you'd have to hang it on your rearview mirror like everybody else.
I got to move that little air freshener first.
You got nowhere to stick it. Online radio also remains stable. But look, here we see the real growth on this chart. The real change is podcasts. And podcasts go from 19% of riders and drivers say they've ever used them to 26%. That's a fairly significant increase over 2 years, and it might just be a harbinger of things to come, John.
Ooh, harbinger. Isn't that one of the bingo card words?
No, but that's a drink word. You have to. What are you drinking today in your Infinite Dial mug, by the way?
Infinite Dial brand coffee.
I'm drinking a California champagne. It's noted.
Fermented in the bottle.
Fermented in the bottle, noted for its excellence. Thank you. We also asked people, what is the audio source you use most often? And again, the car remains fairly stable. There has been a slight decline in AM/FM radio, 57% 2 years ago to 52% this year. So there's been a small decline, obviously not a very rapid one. And the only other real significant difference to talk about in this graph is if you combine online audio and podcasts, those two categories combined have gone from 12% in this graph to 16% this year. So things have changed a little bit. Obviously, things in the car change much more slowly because we don't buy new cars very often, but we are starting to see some movement. And these last 2 graphs in this section really tell an interesting story. When I first saw this slide, I was mildly surprised. I'm not surprised by much, John. I was mildly surprised that phone seemed to have taken a pause here. Why would this go down? It was 42% say they've ever listened through their cell phone in the car, and that could be with a USB connection, that could be Bluetooth, that could be just an audio patch cable, however you want to rock it. And that went down this year to 41% of the US population. Now, why did this go down? Well, here's one compelling reason. The percentage of people who say they have an in-dash information and entertainment system has actually gone up significantly. If you have one of these entertainment systems, you don't need to plug your cell phone into your car. That's gone from 15% last year to 19%. And again, people don't buy new cars that often, so this is not a category that we expect to see hurling stick growth in. Haha, bingo players. But this is fairly significant year over year. So, what are people listening to in those cars, John?
Well, Tom, they're listening to online audio. And now we're going to dive into specific audio brands and talk about consumption of those brands. Every brand on this list enjoys greater awareness today compared to just 1 year ago. The exceptions would be Deezer, Slacker, and 8Tracks. They were each about flat. Once again this year, Pandora tops the list with 89% awareness. iHeart's closed the gap a bit from last year, while Spotify falls in rank as awareness of Apple Music and Amazon Music increases. Apple and Amazon are tied for greatest increase in awareness, as they each increased from 60% in 2018 to 74% in 2019. Pandora leads again in terms of monthly usage. Now, this is usage, not awareness. And even though iHeart, Apple, and Amazon Music each enjoy greater awareness, more people say they use Spotify on at least a monthly basis. Now, here's our 3-year trend showing the monthly use of Pandora declining slightly over those past 3 years, while everyone else sees increases, or in the case of Google Play All Access, remains flat to 2018. Now let's look at monthly use broken out by demo. This is persons 12 to 34, and the big winners here are Spotify and SoundCloud. Monthly use of Pandora drops off a bit more rapidly with this younger group, while Google continues to be flat, or Google. The story is a bit different as we look at persons 35 to 54. Use of Pandora is increasing with this demographic, as is consumption of all of the others, well, except for Google Play, which is flat once again. iHeartRadio is trending up more consistently with this group, unlike the 12 to 34-year-old group where they've been a bit up and down. A reminder that we've been looking at consumption by people who told us they listened in the past month. Now let's look at the weekly listening to these services. And here's our rundown of the percent of Americans 12 plus listening to the top audio brands weekly. At this point, you pretty much know how these slides go, so I'll just give you a minute with it. There, you done? Yeah. All right, good. Now let's look at the 3-year trend. Our 3-year trend of weekly listening. Pandora holds onto the number 1 slot with 22%, but Spotify has almost closed the gap with a big increase this year, moving up from 16 to 20%. A big 50% increase for Amazon Music, albeit off of a relatively small base, and Google Play, once again, about flat. We asked our Infinite Dial respondents which audio brand they use most often, and here's what they told us. Pandora leads here as well, with 30% saying Pandora is the online audio brand they use most often. Spotify is second at 25%, and the others are in the 4 to 11% range. 13% say they most often use some service other than these top audio brands. Amongst the major online audio services, Google once again brings up the rear. Now let's take a minute to drill down on one of these services, which I apparently did a little early on that slide. We'll go back for a moment in case you missed it. Where is it? Sorry, folks. Anyway, we're gonna go to this one. This is a different look at that same data, this time highlighting Amazon Music and its 9% share of most often-ness, meaning that 9% of our respondents told us that Amazon Music is the service they use most often. Right? Now, through the magic of cross-tabulation, let's look at what the owners of smart speakers told us. What they told us is they use Amazon Music a lot more than non-smart speaker owners. I think it's safe to assume that we'll see Amazon Music continue to grow along with the increased penetration of smart speakers. Of course, most people identify YouTube with video, but many use YouTube for music. Google relaunched the YouTube Music service in the first half of 2018 with new features to make it more competitive with Spotify and Apple Music. This included a premium ad-free product and the ability to listen when the phone is locked. We're seeing a considerable move up in the number of people who report listening to YouTube Music weekly, now at 50%. And it's younger people who seem to be flocking to YouTube for music, whereas the 55 plus crowd must still be going there for cat videos. Well, that's the 2019 rundown of audio brands. And now the part of the Infinite Dial that everyone, especially Tom, has been waiting for, the part where I don't screw up the slides.
Well,
the podcast.
It still could happen. You're close enough to the
close
clicker
enough
that it could happen. First of all, I'd like to remind everybody that if you would like to listen to this webinar as a podcast, just close your eyes. Thank you. I got a feeling, John. I got a feeling
What's that feeling, Tom?
that tonight's going to be a good night.
For podcasting?
For podcasting.
For podcasting.
Yeah. You know, we've been tracking podcasting for quite a long time, actually, since 2006. And as anybody who's followed the Infinite Dial over the years knows, it has grown every year, kind of slow and steady. But we certainly have had a feeling internally before we fielded the data that this could be kind of a good year for podcasting. There's just so much more increased traffic, so much more increased volume, and we hear it from our clients as well. So without further ado, let's have a look at the podcasting numbers for 2019. The first question we always ask is, are you familiar with the term podcasting? And this year, 7 in 10 Americans say they are familiar with the term podcasting. That's up from 64% last year, and that's an estimated 197 million Americans. That's
a lot of Americans.
That ain't nothing. That ain't nothing. Now, as I like to mention on this slide, these are people that are familiar with the term. That certainly does not mean that they listen, and it also doesn't mean that they know what a podcast is. In fact, the gap between the people who currently ever listen to podcasting and these people who say that they are familiar with the term, really kind of 3 groups of people in there. One group are people that have heard the term but don't really know what a podcast is. The second group are people that have heard the term, maybe they know what they are, but they just haven't found a reason or a show compelling enough to them to change their other media habits. And then, of course, there is a percentage in there of what you would call trier rejectors, people who maybe once listened to a podcast a long time ago, but now don't count themselves as a listener. They perhaps heard my podcast back in 2005, which turned them off from me and the medium in general, which would not surprise me. So that's awareness. Let's start looking at usage. First of all, this is a key milestone for podcasting. Make no mistake, this is podcasting crossing into the majority. This is the percentage of the population 12 plus who say they've ever listened to a podcast, and it's finally crossed half. 51% of Americans 12 plus, an estimated 144 million Americans now say they have ever listened to a podcast. That's a very sizable jump from last year's 44. That's ever. Let's have a look at monthly. And again, we see significant growth here. In fact, it's the largest percentage point gain in the history of the Infinite Dial. We now see 32% of Americans 12 plus telling us that they've listened to a podcast in the last month. That's up from 26% a year ago. That's a sizable increase, and that's now an estimated 90 million people who say they've listened to a podcast in the last month. So our suspicions were correct. It was kind of in the wind this year, and podcasting has really popped beyond its normal growth curve. I won't use a sports stick analogy for that. I already said it anyway. Let's look at how this divides up in terms of demographics. First, we'll look at gender, and you can see that monthly podcast consumption has grown both with men, in fact, pretty significantly with men, from 27% monthly to 36% of men 12 plus listening to a podcast in the last month. Podcasting continues to be somewhat shifted towards men, but that is sort of evening out over the years. But women also increased pretty dramatically from 24% to 29%. So we've seen growth with both men and women. But the more compelling story to me is the demographic story. And there's a fascinating story behind this story. First of all, podcasting has grown in all 3 of these major demographics that we have on the slide. 55 plus, it went from 13% to 17%. 25 to 54, it went up 7 percentage points from 32% to 39%. But look at 12 to 24. 12 to 24 went up 33%, from 30% to 40%. It's 33% growth, 12 to 24. And that's in a demographic that has historically, at least in the earlier days of podcasting, lagged behind 25 to 54. And a part of the big reason of that certainly was content, but also maybe just not knowing that a podcast was for them. We decided to dig into this data a little bit and see what might be driving that. And we hit upon an interesting correlation. Now, I'm not going to say that this is causal because, as Edward Tufte once said, correlation is not causation, but it's a pretty good clue. So here's what we found when we looked at one particular group of 12 to 24-year-olds. We looked at the 12 to 24-year-olds who also use Spotify. Now, these are Spotify listeners, ages 12 to 24, who say they've listened to a podcast in the last month. Last year was about a third of Spotify listeners 12 to 24. This year, after a year in which Spotify has certainly increased its promotion and how it displays podcasts and how it promotes podcasts, that number is now 53%. That's very dramatic growth, 12 to 24. And so am I willing to go out on a limb and say that this is all because of Spotify? No, but it's a strong association, and they have clearly done a lot to bring distribution to a demographic that may not normally come across podcasts. And I think you see at least part of the results of that in this slide. Now, weekly podcast listening has also undergone a significant growth period here. Last year, 17% of the population said they had listened to a podcast in the last week. This year, it's 22%. That's an estimated 62 million Americans. And I'm going to summarize all of these gains here on this next slide because it tells a pretty good conversion story, I think, as you drill down from ever listen to monthly listens to weekly listens. First of all, podcasting added 17 million more Americans 12 plus who are familiar with the term than we had last year. So 17 million more Americans know the term podcasting today than this time in 2018. 20 million more Americans tell us they've ever listened to a podcast year over year. 17 million Americans tell us that they have listened to a podcast in the last month more than last year. And 14 million more Americans tell us they've listened to a podcast in the last week. Pretty good if you think about 20 million to 17 to 14. That's some good funnel action, funnelization. Funnily, last slide in this section here before we get to some observations. We always ask people, what is the number of podcasts you listened to in the last week? The base for this, obviously, are people who say that they listened to a podcast in the last week. So these are just weekly podcast listeners. For several years, the mean for this slide was 5 podcasts per week. Last year, we saw it bump up to 7, and I speculated that at least part of the cause last year might have been the addition of a number of new short daily podcasts, which are easy to add to your audio diet. But we are seeing in our share of ear research that people are spending more time listening to podcasts in general. So it's not necessarily that at all. And it's just, I think simply there's a lot more good content out there. So this year, and we have an innovation this year, John. We do.
You mean beyond that new car dashboard?
Beyond the new car dash. We have Edison's first sliding pie.
Ooh,
would you like to see it?
Yes, I would.
I love pie. This is our first sliding pie. And that mean, again, is 7 podcasts per week. So that number looks like it's sticking. And again, we know from share of ear, the share of ear for the time we spend listening to podcasts as the overall pie of audio has more than doubled in the last 5 years. So this certainly backs that up. Now, we've got a few observations, and I will kick this off to John.
Thank you. Oh, I almost said thanks, Tom. I said thanks,
drink.
Tom. There you go. Drink.
Fermenters in the bottle.
Online audio has reached a new high in weekly time spent listening, now over 16 hours a week. I believe that's quite likely driven by podcasting and adoption of smart speakers.
And podcasting, as we've just seen, it's reached a key milestone. The majority of Americans, 51%, now say they have ever listened to one. So it's now become a majority behavior.
And along with the increases in podcast listening, audiobook consumption has also surged, indicating a trend towards increased spoken word consumption.
Social media usage appears to have stalled. Facebook and Twitter have declined, especially with younger users, and we see Facebook has lost 15 million users over the last 2 years.
And smart speaker ownership continues to grow, approaching 1 in 4 Americans age 12 plus. The average smart speaker user now tells us they possess 2 devices.
We love the Infinite Dial so much that we have a whole bunch of Infinite Dial reports coming out just in the next 2 months. That's 60 days of furious activity.
Yes, indeed.
Furious activity.
There is no off-season.
There is no off-season, no. So in the next 2 months, we're going to see an update of the podcast consumer. And that's a report that we put out every year. And I want to mention a word about that. This year, we made some exciting additions to the Infinite Dials methodology. I've just presented to you the results of the telephone survey that we put out every year as the kind of currency metrics. But we wanted to ask a lot of questions this year. We wanted to ask more questions about podcasting, more questions about online audio. So we simultaneously fielded a 4,000 person online study that we use the infinite dial numbers to weight to and calibrate that data so it's representative of the online population. And that's going to have a lot more detail about podcasting, full demographics, but also more behavioral questions. That's coming out in the next 30 to 60 days. We also have a report called Moms in Media that comes out every year. It's based on the infinite dial, and that's going to talk about the media habits of moms, obviously. And we have a couple more countries to tick off. We have the third in our Infinite Dial Australia series, and the second in our Infinite Dial Canada series. And all of this is coming out in the next 2 months.
Cannot wait for those.
That is a furious pace.
That's furious pace.
So
I don't know how you do it, Frank.
I don't. This is all I do is stand up in front of this camera and read slides.
Slide jockeying.
Slide monkey.
Slide monkey.
Is how I like to call myself. So we've reached the end of this year's presentation of the Infinite Dial 2019. Really a consequential study, I think, in a number of areas, certainly with social media and podcasting findings being pretty significant. So with that, I want to encourage you, if you have questions, please ask them on Twitter. Use the hashtag Infinite Dial. I'll be on Twitter all night on the train, all night on my train back to Boston, answering some of those questions. I'd like to thank everybody involved. You're going to see that we have a very exciting credit sequence coming up, maybe more exciting than the Avengers.
Yeah.
And I especially want to thank you.
Will you be
John.
back at the end?
I will not be back
Or
at the
cameo?
end. Neither. Yes, with a scene from Deadpool 3 at the end of this. Thanks everyone, and thank you, John.
And thank you, Tom.